Good evening all. This is the first time the Frank Archibald Memorial Lecture hasn't been face-to-face, so thanks everyone for Zooming in with us. My name is Noni Hawkins. I'm a proud UN woman. I graduated with the Bachelor of Criminology from the University of New England and am currently studying a Bachelor of Laws. I've been given the honour of emceeing the Frank Archibald Memorial Lecture for 2020. Mr. Frank Archibald advocated for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interests, particularly relating to education. The Frank Archibald Memorial Lecture is dedicated to Frank Archibald and the Archibald family for the contributions made to the community. This is an important event for the Archibald family and the Armidale community and has been since 1986. Tonight, we are honoured to have Professor Michelle Trudgett, our guest speaker, presenting this year's lecture on cementing Indigenous leadership in higher education. Professor Trudgett is zooming in from Sydney at the Parramatta campus. Firstly, I would like to introduce Uncle Colin Ahoy. Uncle Colin is a local elder of the Anawan people, great-grandson of Frank Archibald and elder in residence for the University of New England, and will now deliver the welcome to country.
As we share our knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within its university, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of this country. I am a descendant of the Anawan people and I am a great-grandson of Frank and Sarah Archibald. I would like to begin by paying my respects to the local Indigenous people of the Anawan Nation, the traditional custodians of the land where this important event is being held today. We share the caring of this country with the Dungari, Gumbanga and the Kamilaroi people. We pay our respects to the elders across Australia and acknowledge their wisdom and guidance. We do this with the belief that Aboriginal culture has the power to provide significant healing in the world. It is with great sadness that I have to acknowledge the passing of Auntie Grace Gordon, Frank Archibald's last living daughter. I'd like to pass on my condolences to Auntie Grace's family, in particular her daughter Helen Gordon. Our thoughts are with you at this difficult time. And on behalf of the Archibald family and the Anawan people, welcome.
Thank you, Uncle Colin. I would also like to acknowledge the Anawan Nation that I'm speaking on today. I would like to extend my acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal people that are listening. I would like to welcome and thank Professor Michael Wilmore, Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Arts, Social Science and Education of the University of New England for his participation tonight. We have two apologies, Professor Todd Walker, the Provost and Deputy Vice-Chancellor, as well as the Professor Heiko Daniel, the Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Research, who couldn't attend tonight's proceedings. Before we commence the lecture, I'll quickly go over the housekeeping. After the lecture, there will be time for a Q&A with Professor Trudgett. The Q&A panel is where attendees can write questions that you would like our speaker to answer, which is located at the bottom of your screen. The chat panel is only for comments and will not be used for questions. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A panel. I would now like to welcome the CEO and Vice-Chancellor of the University of New England, Professor Bridget Hayward, who will now introduce our guest speaker.
May I offer a very warm welcome to all the individuals who are participating and are joining the audience of the 2020 Frank Archibald Memorial Lecture. As Noni has already indicated, this is one of those milestone moments in a year that has been full of milestone moments. We're offering for the first time to host the Frank Archibald virtually rather than the joining together in physical spaces, which has been our history and our custom. But each individual is no less welcome. And one of the things that we have experienced is that by using new technologies, one of the things the University of New England was created to take advantage of that we've been able to welcome a much larger and more diverse community to join in our intellectual and academic events. And so I welcome you all again this evening. And what an absolute treasure of an event this will be. It gives me no little pleasure to be the voice welcoming Professor Michelle Trudgett to be the 2020 Frank Archibald Memorial, to offer the 2020 Frank Archibald Memorial Lecture. It would be really nice to say that she's just starting out in her career, and although she's struggling, I'm absolutely confident that she'll get there. But unfortunately, those would be false words. Michelle is an Indigenous scholar who is recognised the world over for the contribution that she is making to the education, strategy and engagement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders within the Australian system, but also an individual whom I know is making contributions to the opportunities for all First Nation peoples to participate effectively through citizenship, to be recognised for their valuable legacy and historical contributions, but also be valued as modern citizens in a modern community in a global society. We're very proud of the fact that an individual of such distinction completed not one, not two, but 3 degrees at the University of New England. She started with a Bachelor of Arts in Aboriginal Studies. She then moved on to a Master of Professional Studies, Aboriginal Studies, and then moved on to a Doctorate in Education. In each of those opportunities, she pursued, first of all, her own quest for knowledge, her own search for the competency, skills and capabilities that would allow her to travel along her journey as a champion for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and to make sure that they receive the education that was appropriate and the education that they truly deserve in a modern Australia. And her achievements in this regard have been recognised across a number of platforms. So it is not only our affirmation of Michelle as an alumnus, but it's also our recognition that others have seen the contributions that she has made. The highly prestigious National NAIDOC Scholar of the Year Award, the Neville Bonner Award for Teaching Excellence in 2018. And then in 2019, we were very proud to have her honoured as the New England Distinguished Alumni Award. But she's also recognised not only for her scholarship of learning and teaching, for her development of strategy to bring effect to the purpose of Indigenous Australians, but also as a scholar and a researcher. She has held 4 Australian Research Council grants as a chief investigator, and she shares responsibility for a number of other projects that have brought many millions in funding towards the opportunity to develop the Indigenous and particularly the Aboriginal knowledge base. Again, I'd like to say that she's a shy, retiring individual. Sadly, she is not, and I'm grateful for that. Michelle holds no caution and no shyness in speaking up for what she believes is important. First of all, she seeks to represent women, and particularly Aboriginal women. And she's not shy in any respect, and we can only be thankful for that. Secondly, she is a champion for education. And in addition to achieving 3 degrees before she was 33, she was appointed to a professorial position before she was 40, and then Pro-Vice-Chancellor by the time she was 45. She sets herself reasonable goals, and she breaks through all the necessary glass ceilings. Again, we can only be deeply proud of her commitment, her energy and enthusiasm, but more importantly, her voice and her passion. And it's particularly her passion for the education of Indigenous Australians, but more so the paradigm about what is Indigenous knowledge and how can Indigenous knowledge be captured in a more appropriate and effective way in order that it makes a meaningful contribution, not only to the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia, but it is enriching of Australia as a nation. I'm also proud to say that that level of ambition, countered by that level of self-awareness, is that what she states is that she believes that almost all of the different barriers and all of the different sectors have respected and acknowledged inclusion, diversity and equity. And I believe that it is her statement that the one yet to be conquered is education, and that she plans within a very short period of time to move on to the next level in the academic hierarchies and to be appointed as a Vice-Chancellor. I'm very comfortable in the role of Vice-Chancellor just at the moment, Michelle. But I would like to welcome your ambition on behalf of Indigenous women, but also on behalf of all Australians. It is an appropriate and fitting ambition that Australia, within the capstone educational offerings that it makes through universities, recognise that we cannot be truly complete, that we cannot truly serve the agenda that is laid out before us unless we truly embrace equity, diversity and inclusion. And I hope that all of us are standing there when you do achieve recognition as a Vice-Chancellor in an Australian university. And if you hang on a few years, I'm quite happy to recommend that it is indeed at your alma mater, the University of New England. But just for now, may I ask you instead to offer the 2020 Frank Archibald Memorial Lecture. It is my personal, very deep and genuine pleasure. On behalf of my Gaelic ancestors, may I say Dachwit. On behalf of my adopted country, New Zealand, and the Indigenous population of New Zealand, may I say Kia ora. And on behalf of the University of New England, may I say welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor. I think that's the biggest and warmest welcome and introduction I've ever received. And yes, you can certainly keep your Vice-Chancellor position for some time, but thank you. I really appreciate those comments. And thank you, Uncle Colin, for the very warm welcome. I would like to pay my respects as well to several people and nations. Firstly, I pay my respect to the Anaiwan people whose lands the University of New England occupies. I also acknowledge the Kamilaroi, Gumbaña and Dangari people who have shared their caring of this beautiful country. I also pay my respects to the Darug people, whose land I have the privilege of being on today as I deliver this lecture from the UNE Parramatta campus. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend this respect to all Indigenous people in this virtual room tonight. I extend this to you, your families and the nations upon whose lands you are on this evening. I am also aware that there are a number of elders and community people gathered at the Keeping Place in Armidale. I would like to acknowledge this important group and pay my respects to each of you. It is your leadership which has blazed the trail for my generation. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the wonderful staff at Arala and the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Bridget Hayward, for the very generous offer to deliver the 2020 Frank Archibald Lecture. This is a truly humbling experience for which I will be forever grateful. Thank you. The Frank Archibald Lecture is such a vital event in the UNE calendar. I pay my respects to the family and friends of Mr. Archibald, thanking them for the absolute honour to contribute to this important legacy. I would also like to acknowledge the passing of Auntie Grace and send my condolences to the Archibald family. The Archibald Lecture Series commenced in 1986, 11 years before I commenced study at UNE in 1997. Over the last 34 years, we have had the pleasure of hearing the wise words of Australians of the Year, Chancellors, pioneers of Indigenous education and scholars, artists, activists, politicians and ministers as they thoughtfully contributed to this remarkable lecture series. I've always enjoyed learning who, from year to year, was going to be selected to deliver the all-important annual lecture. And to be quite honest, I could not have imagined when I was a student that one day I would have the honour of contributing to this series. The impressive array of Indigenous leaders showcased by this enduring series highlights a few really important points. Firstly, it highlights how respected Mr. Archibald is to Indigenous people across the country. Secondly, how well regarded the University of New England is by the Indigenous community. And finally, just how strong, clever and deadly Indigenous people are, and in saying that, how important our contributions are to society. Today, I will be talking about the important role Indigenous people play in higher education. I would like to begin by sharing just a little bit about my own academic journey. I started a law degree at the University of Technology, Sydney, on my 18th birthday. I was young and completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of the institution. And it's fair to say that I felt like a fish out of water, and as a result withdrew after just one semester. I then took a few years off study and did a number of odd jobs. Many of them involved making things, from pizzas to computer modems. Then, at the age of 21, I decided that I wanted to go back to university and study. I knew that in order to succeed, I would need to leave Sydney and be in an environment with less social distractions. I found myself having a cup of coffee one afternoon and reading a copy of the Courier Mail newspaper. There were a few ads for Indigenous people to apply to study at various universities around the nation. I liked the look of two of the ads. One was for a South Australian institution and the other was for UNE. Now, I did the one thing that I would recommend that no potential university student does to determine what institution they enrol in. I tossed a coin. Heads, it was UNE, and tails, it was the South Australian University. Evidently, the coin turned up a heads, and that was the beginning of the most incredible journey, one that would deeply enrich my life and last a lifetime. In 1997, I moved to Armidale, residing in Austin College for the first semester. I made friends with the most amazing bunch of students, many of whom remain my close friends today. One of the incredible aspects that changed my life forever was the cohort of Indigenous students that I met through the Urala Centre. Many of us were away from our families, our friends and our homes. We supported and nurtured one another throughout our journeys, forming tight bonds, and ultimately we became each other's families. What I know now that I didn't realise back then in the 1990s was that we were part of a collective body of students who were relatively new to the Australian higher education sector, and as such, we were writing history. You see, the first university to open its doors in Australia was the University of Sydney, a sandstone institution founded in 1850. This was followed by the formation of several other institutions: Melbourne University in 1853, the University of Adelaide in 1874, University of Tasmania in 1890, University of Queensland in 1909, and the University of Western Australia in 1911. By 1911, all 6 states had a university. However, in comparison to today, the numbers were very low, with only 3,000 students enrolled nationwide, and 2/3 of that group were enrolled in either Sydney or Melbourne University. A university education was an opportunity for the elite who were centred in the state capitals. Unlike many of the internationally renowned institutions, Australian universities were usually designed by people who had minimal, if any, knowledge about the higher education sector. Some argued that this proved to benefit the Australian higher education architects, as it helped them with their innovation, given they were not attempting to replicate another country's institution. So higher education has now existed in Australia for 170 years, yet participation of Indigenous Australians within the sector has occurred for just over half a century. This relatively recent entry of Indigenous Australians to the higher education system has been underpinned by equity aspirations and the ongoing endeavour to reach parity of participation and outcome. Remarkable change has occurred over the last 50 to 60 years, spurred by the energies and ambitions of Indigenous people. The first Indigenous person to receive a tertiary qualification is believed to be Dr. Weir, who was awarded a Diploma of Physical Education from Melbourne University in 1959. At the postgraduate level, the first Indigenous person known to receive a doctoral qualification was Dr. Jonas, who was awarded a PhD from the University of Papua New Guinea in 1980. So how might people like myself think about this in terms of our own positioning in society and the academy? For starters, it indicates that when my parents were born in 1954, not one Indigenous person had graduated from any degree in Australia. It also signified that one generation later, when I was born in 1975, not one Indigenous person had ever graduated with a doctoral qualification, not one. I am pleased, however, to report that things have changed in more recent decades. For instance, the number of Indigenous students enrolled in higher education has significantly increased over time, from just one student enrolled in 1959 through to 21,000 in 2019. I should point out here that I'm using last year's statistics as this is the most recent full data set that's available. Though really notably, of these 21,000 students enrolled last year, a remarkable 542 were enrolled in doctoral qualifications, which is a great sign. Now, this growth is a direct result of a range of factors, including the advocacy of Indigenous leaders who have gone before us, paving the way for Indigenous people to have a rightful place in Australian universities. For half a century, the work of Indigenous people has informed the sector. The pioneers have effectively disrupted education systems through hard work, perseverance, and have done so while experiencing relentless racism and discrimination. I cannot for one second imagine the magnitude or volume of barriers the pioneers of Indigenous education faced. However, I would like to pause for a moment and say the most heartfelt and sincerest thank you to them for their legacy. They have paved the way and made it possible for myself and others to follow. It was the early 1970s when we saw the introduction of programs and mechanisms to support Indigenous students. The first Indigenous support unit was established in 1973 in association with the Aboriginal Task Force program at the South Australian Institute of Technology. The Aboriginal Task Force was the beginning of Indigenous-specific support in higher education. It created the blueprint for other Indigenous support units by establishing the basic functions necessary to support Indigenous students in higher education, such as special entry conditions, academic support, counselling services, the provision of a separate space, and the encouragement and support of an Aboriginal identity. Many of the Indigenous higher education centres, once largely student support focused, have morphed into fully fledged schools or departments, progressing teaching and research in Indigenous studies alongside student support. There is also an increasing number of Indigenous-led research centres. The Centre for Advancement of Indigenous Knowledges and also Jumbana Research Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney, are just two examples of outstanding research centres within the same institution. Curricula, particularly in the professions, now includes discipline-relevant Indigenous perspectives, primarily through Indigenous graduate attributes. It would be tempting to think that this change has occurred naturally over time. However, that would be to overlook the vital work done by Indigenous staff, both academic and professional. Over the past 50 years, there's been a number of formal Indigenous groups, networks and organisations formed. The central component that is core throughout all these groups is advocacy. Some of these groups were specifically designed to inform government officials, while others were established to provide guidance to the sector. The Indigenous Higher Education Advisory Committee, otherwise known as IHIAC, was an all-Indigenous ministerial advisory group appointed to provide policy advice to the federal government on the matters related to Indigenous Australians in higher education. The Council, which first met in March 2005, quickly identified a set of priorities, including student retention and success, research and development, greater recognition of Indigenous studies, and workforce and governance issues. The IHIAC submission to the review of higher education emphasised the entrenched underrepresentation of Indigenous people in higher education, calling for the national approach to an ongoing inequity that would echo through the Bennett Review and finally find expression in Universities Australia's Indigenous Strategy. Another group worth mentioning is the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education Consortium, otherwise known as NATSIHEC, which seeks to influence and advocate Indigenous interests with government and educational institutions. They also seek to increase the availability of higher education within our communities. And NATSIHEC is open to any Indigenous people working in the sector. But the most recently established group certainly needs to be mentioned. This is the National Indigenous Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellor group. This group, which I am an active member of, formed in mid-2019 with a mandate to provide a transformative platform for engagement with the sector at the nexus of the academic endeavour, community engagement and professional practice in preserving and ensuring culturally appropriate higher education services to Indigenous communities. Despite steady increases in student numbers, there remains a considerable and stagnant disparity in terms of the number of Indigenous people working in higher education compared to that of non-Indigenous people. Indigenous people account for a total of 3.1% of the Australian population, yet account for only 1.2% of full-time equivalent staff employed in the Australian higher education system. It is apparent that the Australian higher education system needs to do more to support, develop and maintain Indigenous staff, particularly to ensure that we reach population parity of 3%, which, let's face it, is not really an overly ambitious benchmark. The steady increase of Indigenous people choosing to study and then work in Australian institutions has resulted in the gradual increase of formal Indigenous leaders across the higher education sector. And if I may briefly indulge, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge Emeritus Professor Marianne Benzalic as one of the remarkable pioneers of Indigenous education. Amongst Professor Benzalic's very long, distinguished and impressive list of accomplishments, she was the first Indigenous person to get a doctorate from Harvard University. She is someone who has forged a path for others to follow. And I'm incredibly fortunate in my position as Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Education Strategy and Consultation at Western Sydney University, as I get to work closely with Professor Benzalic in her role as a member of our Board of Trustees. And of key relevance to us tonight, Professor Benzalic delivered the Frank Archibald Lecture back in 1993. But back in 2003, Professor Marianne Benzalic wrote a paper called Cultural Safety, Let's Name It. And in this paper she stated, and I quote, "Until we have our own Indigenous Pro-Vice-Chancellors to oversee Indigenous issues. Universities will continue to make decisions on our behalf, and to date, these decisions have not all been positive." End quote. Professor Benzalic was well before her time. It was not until 6 years later that Charles Darwin University appointed the first Indigenous Pro-Vice-Chancellor in the country with the appointment of Professor Steve Larkin. The last decade has seen a dramatic increase in the number of Indigenous Pro-Vice-Chancellor positions, and we even have a couple of Indigenous Deputy Vice-Chancellors. While the pace of change seems rapid, the extent of the corridors to which Indigenous academic leaders have access remain narrow, with trajectories impeded by invisible barricades. This notion of Indigenous leaders, and more broadly, Indigenous leadership, is paramount to the discussion tonight. I've had the fortune to create a strong research partnership with the wonderful Professor Susan Page, an incredible Aboriginal woman who I have deep respect for. Over the last decade, we have undertaken a number of research projects that focus on important issues impacting Indigenous people in higher education. For example, we have focused on improving opportunities for Indigenous higher degree research students, early career academics, and are currently undertaking a large-scale project examining Indigenous leadership in higher education. We have a wonderful Wiradjuri PhD student by the name of Stacey Coates, and also a very talented research officer by the name of Rhonda Povey working on this particular project with us. During the last 2 years, we have conducted interviews with 3 recruiters, 14 Indigenous leaders holding positions similar to mine, 31 senior executive, including 27 of the Vice-Chancellors, 19 Indigenous academics, and 13 senior First Nation leaders in Canada, New Zealand, and North America. The project is highlighting how significant and incredibly important Indigenous people, culture, and knowledge is to the higher education sector, not just in areas that have a primary focus on Indigenous staff and students, but all aspects of university business. One aspect that actually dawned on us recently was that we had not stopped to define the concept of Indigenous leadership. Instead, we spoke about it as though we had developed a mutual understanding of what it entailed. Now, this is unlike many other areas of research, where the focal point is defined very early on in the study. Take, for example, one of my other research projects, where we are looking to build strategies to best support Indigenous early career researchers. For that study, we used the widely accepted definition for what an early career researcher means. That is, someone who completed their doctoral qualification within the last 5 years. Yet, for Indigenous leadership research, we had not stopped to establish what we believed Indigenous research actually entailed. Now, I've thought about this oversight quite deeply in recent weeks, and I realise that it is perhaps due to the fact that the concept of Indigenous leadership is often ingrained in us from a very young age. As we grow up, we have great teachers and mentors who kindly share their knowledge. They do so in the spirit of creating a better place for us now, but also with the vision of establishing something dynamic for future generations to come. Our elders particularly leave a legacy of knowledge, hope, and inspiration. This is an integral part of Indigenous society. This is also transferable when we think about the higher education landscape. We need to think of leadership broadly, and then from that can build to articulate what Indigenous leadership entails. At present, a working definition is as follows. Leadership is a practical skill that encompasses the ability to encourage and guide others, to maximise efforts towards the achievement of a common goal. Leadership is not a form of authority or power. Instead, leadership stems from social influence. Characteristics of leadership include, but are not limited to, diplomacy, collaboration, innovation, and inspiring a shared vision. Indigenous leadership includes the usual aspects of leadership, but then advances such concepts to include Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous ways of knowing, of being, of doing, of connecting. Importantly, Indigenous leadership is heavily connected to our responsibilities and commitment to the Indigenous community, with a strong focus on Indigenous sovereignty. Indigenous culture informs our practices and draws on our lived experience to provide a unique form of leadership excellence. Characteristics of Indigenous leadership include, but are also not limited to, resilience, advocacy and activism, courage and commitment. An additional component of Indigenous leadership is the fact that it often has a future focus as well as a past focus. It extends beyond the sheer benefits to a particular organisation or group in the immediate time. As such, Indigenous leadership actualises a vision to create opportunities for future generations. Now, this is, of course, a fluid definition, one that we will continue to refine throughout the course of our research. The main elements that I would like to get across here is that Indigenous leadership is extremely complex. It's practiced over time, it's linked to community, and should never be underestimated nor deemed simplistic. Importantly, a key concept of Indigenous leadership is the underpinning foundation of Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing. Now, I'd like to talk about some ways that Indigenous leadership can bring enormous benefits to the higher education sector. Indigenous leadership is infused throughout our institutions by a range of Indigenous people. For example, the leadership we see across our institutions that is provided by our students is an integral component of core business. They often provide leadership through formalised structures, such as student representative councils and academic senate, through to more informal leadership to their peers. The great friends I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture certainly provided me with informal leadership support. Indigenous academics and professional staff employed in various schools, faculties and divisions across the university provide leadership to fellow Indigenous staff and students, but also non-Indigenous staff and students. Key components of their work is what many of us refer to as unrecognised cultural business. Another vitally important Indigenous leadership role in higher education is the role that our elders play, often through positions such as elders in residence. At Western Sydney University, we have the fantastic Auntie Jean South, who has held that position since 2008. At UNE, there is the wonderful Uncle Colin Ahoy. The contributions that these elders make to our institutions are immeasurable as they share their wisdom with staff and students. Now, it wasn't too long ago that Indigenous people were denied access to boardrooms. The only way that we got near the table was to be serving those at the table. However, Indigenous leaders continued to bang on those boardroom doors until they began to open. We have gradually been invited to sit at the table, to be part of the conversation, but rarely to be head of the table. If we consider this in light of the higher education sector, it is true that we have gradually seen more Indigenous deans, pro-vice-chancellors and even a couple of deputy vice-chancellors emerge over the last decade or so. In this capacity, we are joining the executive tables in our universities. Now, this is certainly a good start. We need to be at those tables to be part of the high-level conversations that impact our entire institution. We have incredible Indigenous leaders in these positions who advocate for Indigenous people through such avenues. And I'd particularly like to acknowledge the outstanding body of work my colleagues in the National Indigenous Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Deputy Vice-Chancellor group undertake to advocate for Indigenous agency in higher education. They are an incredibly impressive group of leaders. However, despite such Indigenous leadership excellence within our universities, it is important to point out that we are not the heads of tables in university boardrooms. We have, however, seen two Indigenous chancellors. The first being Dr. Pat O'Shane, who held the chancellor position at UNE from 1994 to 2003. And on a side note, I must say that I take tremendous pride in the fact that 2 of my 3 degrees from UNE have Dr. O'Shane's signature on them, the nation's first Indigenous chancellor. Canberra University appointed the second Indigenous Chancellor, Professor Tom Calma, who has held that position since 2014. Now, when we think about it, it's terrific that we are seeing an emerging group of Indigenous deans and pro-vice-chancellors, and it's great to see that we've started to see a couple of chancellors. But overall, this is just not good enough for a nation's higher education sector that prides itself on being inclusive, innovative and ethical. There is a stark void at the provost and vice-chancellor levels of university leadership. No mainstream university in this country has ever appointed an Indigenous Australian person to the position of vice-chancellor. We now have well over 100 Indigenous professors, many of whom have held a senior leadership position for some time. They are expected to have the same leadership attributes to non-Indigenous leaders, plus an additional skill set that encompasses complex cultural pieces and considerations. During the course of the leadership research, we asked several of the Vice-Chancellors when they think we might see an Indigenous person appointed to the position of Vice-Chancellor. The more optimistic responded by saying perhaps in the next 5 years or so, while others believed it was a long way off. Now let's think about this. Why might it be some time before we see an Indigenous Vice-Chancellor? The answer was clear. They believed that most of the senior Indigenous leaders held Indigenous-specific portfolios, and that these portfolios were indeed too narrow and limited, not encompassing enough broader university work. Now, this is indeed an interesting observation, as when we asked the Indigenous leaders a set of similar questions, they believed that their positions had both breadth and depth, encompassing all areas of the university. These positions stretch across a range of areas, including learning and teaching, research, philanthropy, marketing and branding, buildings, procurement, engagement with a range of internal and external stakeholders, recruitment and human resources, events, internationalisation, finance, and of course all the strategic pieces that underpin those areas. There is a clear discrepancy between what the Vice-Chancellors believe these senior Indigenous leaders do in those roles and what the roles involve. And I should point out here that this is certainly not a disgruntled comment by any means, as I am extremely fortunate to have a highly engaged and incredibly supportive Vice-Chancellor at Western Sydney University in Professor Barney Glover, whose leadership is simply outstanding. But rather, the question I pose is how do we get the senior leaders across the higher education sector to acknowledge and even respect the size and the scope of such positions so that those holding those positions are in fact deemed suitable candidates for provost and vice-chancellor positions in the future? How do we convey that our leadership is informed by tens of thousands of years of survival and resilience. Despite the frequently lamented barriers to success in higher education for Indigenous Australians, there is some cause for celebration and quiet optimism. Arguably, in some universities, Indigenous Australians are no longer on the margins, but central to the institutional mission, recognised for their intellectual and professional contributions. It is not, however, a time for reducing our efforts. Universities Australia's Indigenous strategy acknowledges that Indigenous success in universities is both an important national project and a project of national importance. No university is doing exceptionally well in all areas of Indigenous education, although there are certainly some clear frontrunners emerging. Every university in Australia should aspire to have a senior Indigenous position who is trusted and supported to drive whole of university approaches. Parity in Indigenous undergraduate and postgraduate completions will fuel higher education sector growth in workforce and research, as well as contributing to Indigenous communities. Vast numbers of graduates entering employment with the capacity to work effectively with and for Indigenous Australians is an ambitious aspiration with genuine transformative potential. Predicting what the sector might look like in the future is a gratifying task, as there is so much opportunity to transform it. We need to alter the architecture of our institutions so that they deliberately consider and respond to incorporating Indigenous people in the strategic design. We have the opportunity to transform how we think and how we talk about our universities, refraining from labelling them as Western institutions and instead shifting the dialogue so we start referring to them as global institutions. Martin Luther King is famous for saying that he had a dream on the 28th of August in 1963 as he delivered a speech that would go down in history. I too have a dream. I dream that in the future we will see our universities as central components to Indigenous communities. I dream that our Indigenous students will know that they have a place and every chance of success. I dream that non-Indigenous students will learn more about Indigenous culture and people. I dream that all non-Indigenous staff will be our allies and that new relationships are formed to share the load. I dream that we will have Indigenous people fulfilling senior roles throughout all portfolios of the university. I dream that we will see Indigenous Vice-Chancellors and more Indigenous Chancellors. I dream that the original pioneers of Indigenous education will be proud of what the sector becomes. After all, my dreams are only possible because of the legacy that they have provided. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Professor Trudgett, for your informative and insightful lecture. I will now open the floor to questions from the Q&A. The first question from Dawn is, some universities have removed their elder in residence positions. What strategies can the higher education sector take to ensure the authority, wisdom and advocacy provided by our elders are heard by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous management at universities?
Would you like me to answer that one, Noni?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, I think that that's a great point. Our elders in residence are absolutely vital to the functions, the core functions of our university. I think it's very much an institution by institution basis, I would certainly advocate for every university in the country to have elders in residence. They're very important.
Thank you. I'm going to jump straight into the next question, Professor Trudgett. In what ways can or do Australian universities ensure they are seeking out and hiring Indigenous academics in their leadership roles?
Oh, that's a great question. I think by creating opportunities and seeing the vast amount of spaces which Indigenous academics can contribute to leadership. So, for example, at Western Sydney University, in the past 6 to 12 months, I think, well, since the beginning of 2020, we now have 2 Indigenous Associate Dean positions implemented, which is great. So Dr. Corinne Sullivan and also Arnie Professor Kerry Doyle have those roles, and we're looking to create more of those roles across the various schools. So that's one way you can do it within your schools. On top of that, I'll be looking to create senior positions working with me in the near future. So I think the world is our oyster. And I think it's also important to try to have Indigenous people at the highest level. So for us, we call it the Board of Trustees at Western. A lot of universities will call it University Council. To have Indigenous people that are really active in university business in those spaces is important as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have another question just coming in. So Professor Trudgett, what do you think are some of the immediate steps we should be taking to ensuring we have an Indigenous Vice-Chancellor sooner rather than later?
Oh, I feel like I'm in the hot seat with the $1 million question here. Look, I think one of the things that the current Vice-Chancellors could do is to see talent where it is. And as I say, my colleagues across the country, you know, they have so much talent, and I think would make great provosts and great Vice-Chancellors in the future. You know, and it would be great if the Vice-Chancellors offered to mentor some of those people into those positions. I think that acknowledging that Indigenous people holding senior leadership positions actually do have both breadth and depth and a lot of experience, particularly in relation to reporting to government, engaging with community, engaging with industry partners. It's really, really broad.
Perfect. Okay, we're moving on to the next question. How can non-Indigenous researchers and academics become an ally at university?
Yeah, these are all great questions. Thanks to the audience. So I think it's really important that non-Indigenous people do take the time. You know, time I think is first and foremost. The time to learn a little bit and reach out to the right people, and know that relationships do take time and they need to be approached with ultimate respect. But I think you'll find that Indigenous people really are keen to work with non-Indigenous people to improve our country. You know, let's have a great society that we are proud of, all proud of.
Great answer. Okay, so we have a question from Marcel. What advice would you give Indigenous academics on how to balance the competing demands on our time? We are often called upon to perform more service than other non-Indigenous counterparts, while also completing higher degree research studies, research and teaching.
Marcel, thank you for the question. Another great one. It really is a great one. I think one of the things that we can do is, as universities, really acknowledge the unrecognised work that Indigenous academics do, because there is a lot of it. There's a lot of additional community work, there's a lot of additional committee work, There's a lot of additional student support work. And for deans, for example, to actually think about that in terms of workload. So one example at a previous institution, we got people to be what we called Indigenous Graduate Attribute Champions. So they worked with us in terms of building the Indigenous Graduate Attribute knowledge throughout their schools. And as a result of that, they got we wrote a PD, and that got 10% workload. So I think it's up to executive in universities to really have a good look at the additional work that Indigenous academics do and to account for that accordingly.
We have a question from Anne-Marie. Universities love competition. What do you think of leagues tables for driving improvements?
I'm getting them all thrown at me this evening. Look, I think we do need to measure things, and we do need to know how we're going as institutions, and we do need to be able to place ourselves in worldwide rankings and so on. So I think the information is useful, but I think you also have to assess it and examine it with a bit of a grain of salt, and realising that different ranking systems approach different things in different ways. But I think ultimately impact, and I'm about to chair the ARC ERA EI Indigenous Working Group, and you know, within that, I think impact is really important. And how does Indigenous research particularly impact our communities?
Thank you. So we have a question from Melody. In order to have more Indigenous staff and leaders in universities, is it important to go through higher degree research in order to become academic staff? What factors do you think might increase numbers of Indigenous higher degree research?
So this is, I love this question. This was actually the subject of my doctoral thesis, which I started researching in, I think it was 2005, finishing in 2008. So it's an area I'm really passionate about, and having researched it for 15 years. But basically, yes, I think that we need more Indigenous people with high degree research. I think that we need to have the skill sets and the qualifications to really own our space at the table. You know, I kept talking about our space at the table. Well, I think it is important. For Indigenous HDR students now, there's a lot more support mechanisms in 2020 than there were, you know, when I did it even a decade ago, or, you know, 12 years ago. So I think, yes, I'd encourage more Indigenous people to enrol in HDR. We have only had about 500 or so Indigenous people ever get a doctoral qualification. You know, these days we're turning out about 50 a year, which is great, but when you consider we've got 40 institutions in the country, that averages out to, you know, roughly one per institution, which is not so great. So we've got a lot more work to do in this space, but it is certainly improving. And with more Indigenous academics at the higher level with doctoral qualifications, this is a process that I think, you know, we'll see advancement of in the coming years.
Perfect. Okay, so what are some of the few key barriers to reaching Indigenous students and youth, influencing them to progress to higher education?
Yeah, I think for some Indigenous people, you know, they are the first in family to go to university. I think we're starting to see a shift in dialogue to now the second, which is great, But for many Indigenous students, it's a foreign space still, which is unfortunate. And we just need to break down those barriers to make it a more culturally inclusive space, I think, which is really important. So that mentoring role model piece is certainly critical to the discussion. The other piece, I think, is acknowledging that a lot of Indigenous people have expectations and commitments from family, from community and so on, and these need to be managed in order to ensure that they've got the best chance of success in higher ed.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to Jane's question. So Jane is a staff member at UNE. She often works closely with the Arala Centre. So how can we assist Indigenous students to stay and progress in their studies? What helped you to feel a sense of belonging and want to continue with your studies?
Yeah, for me it was finding the right institution. As I shared at the start of the lecture, the first place I went didn't work out, and UNE was just the perfect fit for me. There's so much support, and I've seen it grow from strength to strength from my time to now. You know, I think having that community of students around other students is absolutely vitally important. I think having that safe space that students feel is their home away from home is really important. And having those more senior academics that they can go to ask for advice and guidance is really important.
Perfect. Okay, following on, we have a question from Gail. How accessible is tertiary education for the average primary student in remote areas?
The average primary student is in primary school student?
I believe it's just more of the average students, so students you come across commonly.
Okay. A lot of universities these days are doing a lot of outreach work for regional and remote areas. UNE does a great job servicing the New England area. At Western Sydney, we have a remote outreach program. So I think the partnerships for the communities with various universities is really essential. And if a community doesn't have that partnership in place, I suggest that they reach out to a university to see what relationship could be formed, because ultimately that's what it comes down to. It's all about relationships.
Okay, we have a question from Melissa. How can current students be good allies with you in this important journey?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Melissa, great question. I think that Indigenous staff just love working with our students. Our students are phenomenal. I get so much joy personally from having interactions with our students and watching them grow. I know that there's students that I have a lot of connection with these days that I know is going to last a lifetime. So my advice for the students would be just to reach out and start forming that relationships, because it will often be welcomed by Indigenous academics and professional staff.
Great, couldn't agree more. We have a question from John. Ideally, where would you like to see Indigenous education in universities in 2030?
Oh, I love future prediction questions. Thank you, John. Look, John, I think that every single year, we see advancement. So what we see in 2020 is going to be different to what we see next year and the year after. I hope that by 2030, we do have a situation where every student, regardless of whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, graduating from every single Australian university, does leave with the ability to work effectively with and for Indigenous people. And it's that for bit that really I think is important. Regardless of what discipline that they enrol in, I would like that as my number one sort of target for students. My voice is getting a bit scratchy here, Noni.
No worries, Professor Trudgett. So that's all the time we have for questions, unfortunately. Thank you so much for your answers, and to all those attendees for your questions. I would now like to invite Professor Wilmore to propose the vote of thanks to Professor Trudgett.
Thank you very much, Noni, and thank you, Professor Trudgett, for an inspiring lecture. The Frank Archibald lecture is such an important part of the calendar of this university, and you've followed in a long tradition of inspiring speakers in giving us some incredible thoughts, sharing some incredible thoughts and some great ideas at this lecture. I think one of the most important things that you did right at the beginning was offer us a really inspiring image of you as a young student tossing a coin and leaving it to chance as to where you might find yourself on your own journey in higher education. I think what you've told us about in exploring your own personal journey and sharing your ideas is a vision of the future where things are not left to chance for future students and for future Indigenous students and for future Indigenous staff members in our universities. We can't afford to leave it to chance that people will find their way into higher education, and we can't leave it to chance that people will thrive and prosper within our higher education system. So you've given us some really important ideas today about what we need to do as people working in higher education, as people working in higher educational institutions in all sorts of different capacities, and right the way up to the very top of our institutions in the senior leadership of universities, to ensure that we make institutions that create opportunity for students and for staff to thrive and prosper. You've indicated that this is not an easy thing to do, and ensuring that we create those chances and opportunities is actually going to require us often to challenge some long-held, often centuries-held notions of what it means to be a leader in higher education. I think your observations on the narrow definitions that people sometimes have of leadership in institutions was incredibly important, because that issues a call to action for all of us, not just to turn around and say to Indigenous students and Indigenous academics and Indigenous staff, what are you going to do to fit into our institutions? But what are we going to do, all of us collectively, to make sure that we have institutions that are welcoming of the talent and the knowledge and the skills and the capability of every single person that comes to us, so that we can create institutions that are not narrowly configured, but are institutions that actually are places where Indigenous leadership can thrive and prosper, right the way up to the highest level of leadership in a university. So I certainly share your dream, Professor Trudgett, and I do not think it will be long if we all work in the ways that we need to work collectively before we have universities in Australia that are led by inspiring Indigenous leaders like you. So thank you very much, Professor Trudgett, again for your Frank Archibald lecture. Before I get to the formal offer of a vote of thanks, I also want to acknowledge that we're on Annaman land and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. In particular, I would like to thank all members of the Archibald family who are with us today, and I would like to thank our elder in residence, Professor Uncle Colin Ahoy, for his welcome to country. I'd also like to thank Rose Lovelock, who's hosting an elders viewing of the Frank Archibald lecture this evening at the Armidale Cultural Centre and Keeping Place. I'd like to thank our Vice-Chancellor and CEO, Professor Bridget Hayward, for her welcome. And I'd like to thank Noni Hawkins for being a wonderful MC for today's Frank Archibald lecture. So I know that we are in different locations on Zoom, and normally we would have a rapturous round of applause for Professor Trudgett, but wherever you are, please join me in thanking Professor Trudgett for an inspiring Frank Archibald lecture this year, and give Professor Trudgett a virtual round of applause for being such a wonderful speaker this evening.
Thank you, Professor Wilmore. It's now time to close tonight's event. So thank you to everyone who listened and participated in the QA, and to the speakers who dedicated their time to be here tonight. Thank you all.